Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Ordinary Interesting People, where we discover the lives of people who never made it into the history books, but whose stories are still worthy of being told. Our story this episode focuses on a woman who faced unimaginable hardship, but survived the ordeal. It contains some topics which may upset some people, including mental illness and violence. We have chosen to focus the story on the survivors rather than the perpetrators. The events will be brought to life by the illustrations of my daughter Ella. Our story begins in Melton Mowbray, Leicestershire, at 6 a.m. on Thursday the 2nd of January 1913. Annie Bloxham was a 38-year-old mother of 5. She was woken by her partner bringing her a cup of tea and letting her know that he was heading off to work. Her partner, Alfred Bland, was a bricklayer, aged 36. The couple had had a turbulent week. Alfred had been drinking very heavily the weekend before, and he had threatened Annie. As a result, she had left him for a few days, but on returning on the Sunday, he made comments about what he would do to her if he had a revolver. A macabre statement for any person to hear, but so much worse for Annie. We shall come to that part of her life later. Alfred continued to act strangely, constantly walking up and down the stairs and choosing not to go to work. This wasn't the first time that Annie had left Alfred due to his drinking, but he had never acted so oddly before. Just a few years earlier, in August 1910, Alfred was fined 10 shillings for being drunk and disorderly. A clue as to why Alfred's mental state was so poor, and why he turned to drink so often, may be found if we look to his father, a stonemason called Albert Bland, but who sometimes went by the name Alfred. When Alfred was only 5 years old, his father was brought up before the courts for being drunk in public. He was given the option of a 5-shilling 7d fine or 2 weeks imprisonment. A few years later, Albert was fined a shilling for neglecting to send his children to school. He didn't attend the court hearing, but the school attendance officer made a very telling remark, that the family were in great distress, the mother being deranged. In 1911, Albert was arrested again for destroying a 12-foot fence. He claimed that his land had been taken from him and that he would smash the fence down again. This time he was given the option of a £1 11 shillings fine or to face a month in prison. We get the impression that Alfred would have had a challenging childhood, where drinking to excess and mental health issues were the norm. The couple had also lost a baby, Lily, in 1909, and although they went on to have their youngest, Hilda, a few years later, the pain of losing a child persists. Annie appears to have started a relationship with Alfred in her early 20s. In the 1901 census, the couple aren't listed as being married, and Annie is described as Alfred's domestic servant. However, they had a child together, Annie Bloxham. The couple were living at 3 Gooseberry Square, off Mill Street, a square of 7 properties for working class people. The couple went on to have Mabel, Doris, Percy and Hilda, and the family moved to 33 Snow Hill, a 4-roomed house opposite the brickworks. They never married, the children taking both surnames. Returning to the morning of the 2nd of January, Annie had drunk her tea and gone back to sleep, awakening again around 8 a.m. She believed that her partner Alfred was at work. She walked downstairs and discovered that the door to the middle room of the house was fastened. So she went to the front door and found that this was also fastened. She returned to the first door and she opened it by force, to discover her partner, Alfred Bland, hanging by a rope around his neck. police were called, and they verified that Alfred had died a few hours earlier. A verdict was reached. He had taken his own life. The incident was surely a traumatic one for Annie and her 5 children, aged between 2 and 14. Sadly for Annie, this wasn't the first traumatic experience in her life. At the age of 11, she witnessed something even more shocking than the sight of her partner hanging by his neck. Annie was born on the 18th of December 1874 in Leicester. She was one of 11 children to her father, Thomas Bloxham, a framework knitter, and her mother, Anne Bowley, a laundress and seamer. Her parents don't appear to have been married, and there is evidence that her mother had a previous marriage to a man named Page. The family lived for some years on Grey Street and then Cardigan Street, but then moved to a small house in a court known as Pickard's Yard on Fairfax Street. The house had just 2 rooms downstairs, a living room and kitchen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The house was later demolished, and the site is now the location of the De Montfort University. The job of a framework knitter, a job held by both Annie's father and grandfather, was renowned for being difficult and for paying poorly. The machines required the user to use both hands and feet to work it, an exhausting job. Workers were paid by the garment rather than the hours they worked, and often the whole family would be involved in the process. That doesn't seem to be the case with our family, as the children are listed as working in the shoe business, which suggests that Thomas worked out of the home. The equipment for framework knitting was often rented to workers, and after costs they were left with very little for food and clothing. Annie's father, Thomas Bloxham, was very well known to the police in the local area. He had the nicknames Tommy Rot, Rat, and the King of the Poachers. He had been arrested and charged multiple times for poaching and possessing guns without a licence, as well as assault and threatening to shoot a man when he was caught poaching. Thomas was sentenced to hard labour in prison a number of times, the longest sentence for 12 months when Annie was 2 years old. As well as being imprisoned for poaching-related crimes, Thomas was arrested for drunkenness, assault, larceny, and using threats and obscene language. Sadly for Annie's mother, Anne, a number of these assaults were against her. When Annie was 1 year old, her mother sought police protection from Thomas, and she took him to court on multiple occasions for assault. Neighbours reported that the couple were constantly arguing and fighting, and Thomas would often accuse Anne of drinking and being immoral. Anne would have to come home to see to the children when Thomas was out to avoid his violence, and the family lived in abject poverty. Thomas neglected his children, taking away their bedding and even cooking utensils to sell, leaving the family with almost no furniture. The children used dirty rags and clothing for bedding. Life for Annie and her siblings would have been hard, cold, and uncomfortable, not to mention the fear they must have experienced when faced with their parents arguing. On Friday the 26th of November 1886, Annie was 11 years old. Her mother Anne had been out visiting her parents, who lived nearby, in the afternoon. She was said to be a hard-working woman, and she had taken some of her work with her, seaming garments. She then went to visit her next-door neighbour, Mrs. Green, before heading home to give her children their supper and put them to bed. Annie's father had been hanging around in the streets for days and returned home around 7 p.m. At 7:10 p.m, Thomas Bloxham shot his wife Anne in the chest. Neighbours heard screams, and then, according to newspaper reports, Kate, Annie's 14-year-old sister, ran into the street shouting, "He shot my mother!" On arriving at the scene, they found that Thomas had also stabbed Anne in the neck and cut her throat. It wasn't only Annie and Kate who witnessed the gruesome sight that day. Thomas went upstairs to get his youngest children, Joseph and Albert, to show them their mother's dead body. On leaving the house in handcuffs, he turned to say, "Goodbye, old woman." Newspaper reports say that the boys were sent to stay with Eliza Green, the neighbour Anne had just visited, and it seems Annie was sent to stay with another neighbour. The children were said to be dazed and frightened. The murder was shocking and appeared in many newspapers. Thomas showed no remorse for killing his partner and claimed that Anne deserved to be killed, as she was an alcoholic who neglected her children and cheated on him. These rumours, which were later deemed to be fabrications, would have been alive on the tongues of the local people. We can only hope that the children didn't hear them. By Monday, an inquest had taken place and the jury returned a verdict. Thomas was guilty of taking his wife's life. On the 25th of January, there was a court case in which Thomas claimed his wife had shot and stabbed herself. Evidence to the contrary led to a guilty verdict. The judge said, "The jury could have returned no other verdict than that of guilty." He also said, "I regret to say that this is the second occasion on which within very recent periods it has been my duty to pass a sentence of death in which it has been alleged that the cause of death was the misconduct of the wife. It must be thoroughly understood, and I hope it will be, that this is no justification whatever." Women at this time had far fewer rights than men. Just a few years before Anne's untimely death, women could be imprisoned for up to 6 months for leaving their husbands, and would be forced to return to them. It was socially acceptable for men to beat their wives, and clearly many felt that this was tolerable if the wife had been unfaithful or wronged him in some way. On the 14th of February, Annie's father was executed by hanging for taking the life of her mother. He continued to show no remorse, even on being visited by his teenage daughter Kate. But this isn't a story about Thomas. It's a story about his daughter Annie and her siblings, whose lives were so hugely affected by the events of the 26th of November 1886. What happens to a family when they lose both parents in quick succession, tarnished by the scandal and gossip surrounding their father's actions? Let us first focus on Kate, Annie's older sister, who we know witnessed the murder and visited her father in Leicester prison. A newspaper article said of her visit, "The interview with his daughter, who it will be remembered was in the house at the time of the murder, was of a painful nature, the girl evidently feeling acutely the position in which her father was placed." Kate was 15 by the time she was orphaned. At this age, it is likely that her options would have been the workhouse or to quickly find work, assuming she wasn't already in employment. We know from the 1881 census that her older brother Richard was working as a shoe finisher at this age. By 1891, at the age of 19, she was a boarder living at 15 John Street, a stone's throw away from Fairfax Street. She was working as a wool condenser, possibly at Fairfax Mill opposite where she was staying. She lived with a 34-year-old couple, William Needham, a laster, and Mary Needham, a mender. It was common at the time to take on multiple boarders and expect them to share not just a bedroom, but a bed. So Kate would have been fortunate to have her own space. At the age of 25, Kate married a man named Samuel Hose, a shoe riveter. Samuel had been in some trouble with the police when he was younger, for gambling and theft, and had been imprisoned for 3 weeks. We find Kate in the 1901 census, aged 29, just 4 years later. She's listed as being a widow, living on Beatrice Road with another young widow and mother of 2, Elizabeth Carter. Kate was working as a feeder in a wool factory. However, I can find no record of Samuel Hose's death, or any evidence of him after the marriage. A Samuel Holmes appears in the 1901 census, living with Julia Hose, Samuel's sister, but this may be a coincidence. By 1911, Kate was 39, and sadly, she was residing at 2 Swain Street, the Leicester workhouse. The workhouse would provide a bed and food, keeping you off the streets, but you had to work hard and conditions were harsh. Kate would have had to wear a uniform, and food would have been plain, often bread and dripping. At the time of the census, there were 966 people residing as inmates, 219 of them women. The workhouse had 260 rooms, all presided over by the master and matron of the workhouse, Herbert and Mabel Lavelle. There were 5 members of staff who worked as labour, master, mistress or assistant, ensuring the inmates were working. Distressingly, 10 years later, in the 1921 census, we find Kate once again at Leicester Workhouse. It's unclear whether she managed to leave and then returned, or whether she spent over a decade of her life in the workhouse. Her job is listed as a hosiery factory hand, whereas in the previous census it lists her occupation as a wool sorter, so perhaps she did manage to leave for a while. By 1939, we know that Kate was living with a 78-year-old woman called Anne Burrows, working as domestic help at 48 Thirlby Road, Leicester. She died in 1954, aged 82, having lived a life of hardship. Another member of the family to experience the harsh conditions of Leicester Workhouse was Kate's brother Edmund, who was 16 at the time of his mother's death. 8 months after his father was executed, Edmund was in court for theft. We learned from the record that he was working as an elastic weaver but had no fixed residence. Annie was witness to the fact that whilst visiting the house of his older sister, Mary Ann, and her husband, Alfred Parsons, Edmund stole £2. On another occasion, he stole a pair of trousers worth 7 shillings 6d. When asked why he took the money and clothes from his brother-in-law, he said, "I spent the money to live on." He was given 21 days hard labour. At this time in history, prisons were designed to scare inmates so that they would never offend again. The silence system had been introduced in the 1860s, where inmates were forced to be completely silent and perform pointless hard labour, like turning a hand crank for hours at a time, or walking on a treadmill, more like a modern stairmaster, for 8 hours a day. Food was also very bland and repetitive, and beds were hard wooden boards. After Edmund's time in prison, he ended up in the workhouse. In 1890, he was in court again for damaging benches in the casual ward and for absconding. At the age of 26, Edmund married Margaret Halford. Things seemed to have been going a lot better for him and the family. They were living in a small terraced house in Colville in the 1901 census, with 2 children. Edmund was working as a painter's labourer. They went on to have 5 more children. Sadly, things were to take a turn for the worse. In 1921, aged 50, we know that he was out of work. He was still unemployed in December 1934, when he went out one morning and told his wife he'd be back by dinner. A heavy fog fell that night, and his dead body was found the next morning in the street. The 2 younger boys, Joseph, 8, and Albert, 6, who were woken by their father and shown their mother's body, at least had the fortune to avoid the workhouse. Just a few years previously, Leicester Union had opened the Countess Thorpe Cottage Homes to provide accommodation that wasn't in the workhouse for pauper children. Both of the boys spent time there. There were 11 cottages, and each one was populated by 24 children. Each cottage had a house father or mother. But you can imagine, with 24 children to look after, that the role wouldn't have included much in the way of emotional support, to 2 traumatised boys who had lost both parents. The site did at least have a school, an infirmary, workshops and swimming baths. Children were expected to help to clean and cook, and corporal punishment was used for those who disobeyed the rules. So what happened to the boys after they left Countess Thorpe? Albert went to live with his older sister Mary and her joiner husband Alfred. He worked as a barman. Then there seemed to be no record of him after 1901. Joseph took a different path, choosing to join the military, the Leicestershire Regiment, in 1895. When he had completed his service, he moved to Australia. When the First World War began in 1914, Joseph joined the 5th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. He was sent to Gallipoli in Turkey to fight, and on the 7th of August 1915 he lost his life, aged 36. Finally, we come back to Annie. After the death of her parents, she, like her brothers, went to stay with her older sister Mary and her brother-in-law Alfred Parsons. She worked as a wool spinner, like her sister Kate. She of course then met her partner Alfred Bland, had her 6 children, and experienced that awful sight on the morning of the 2nd of January 1913. We find her in the 1921 census, now with the name Annie Bland, living at 61 Merrydale Road, Leicester, with 4 of her children, a son-in-law, Henry Hitchcock, who married her eldest daughter Annie, and a grandson, Arthur Henry. 7 people living in 3 rooms. Annie wasn't working, but 3 of her children were. Times were clearly quite tough. Later, in 1939, she lived with her daughter Mabel and family at 81 Cork Street, Leicester. We know from an advertisement that the house was a modern 6-roomed house with private yard, garden and outbuilding. Mabel's husband Clifford was an engineer, and their first child was born on a ship, the SS Athenic, a passenger liner that departed from Liverpool, possibly to New Zealand, where Clifford lived for a long while. They even named their daughter Mabel Athenic after the name of the ship. One of Mabel's daughters married an American and moved to the US, and it seems the family were fairly well off. Even more so in 1956, when they won £9,236 on the pools. We hope that Annie lived her final years comfortably with her family. She died aged 74 in 1948. It's hard to conceive of so much tragedy in one family, so much grief for so many young children who no doubt carried the scars of their experiences throughout their lives, but continued on nevertheless. For Annie and her siblings, it seems life continued to throw obstacles their way. Workhouses, prison, unemployment, and mental illness. But Annie seems to have given her children the chance to live fulfilling, happy lives of comfort, travel, and positive experiences. Thank you for watching. And please consider liking and subscribing if you're enjoying our content and would like to support our channel. If you have an ordinary interesting person in your family tree who you would like to see featured on the channel, email us the details at ordinaryinterestingpeople@gmail.com.